The life I thought I was supposed to live. For most of my life, I truly believed I was doing everything the right way. I followed the path that was placed in front of me without questioning who designed it or whether it actually belonged to me. I learned early that life seemed easier when I didn't ask too many questions, when I adjusted myself to expectations instead of listening to my own doubts. I was taught, both directly and indirectly, how a good life should look. Be polite. Be reliable. Don't complain too much. Don't make others uncomfortable with your emotions. I absorbed these lessons so deeply that they began to feel like my own thoughts, even when they were not. As the years passed, I became very good at following rules that were never written down. Rules about how much space I was allowed to take, how loudly I could speak, and how often I should put myself second. I thought discipline meant silence and maturity meant endurance. I didn't question this life because it looked acceptable from the outside. I was functioning, dependable, and predictable. People trusted me. They praised my patience. And that praise convinced me that I was living correctly, even though something inside me often felt distant and tired. At the time, I thought discomfort was simply part of being an adult. I assumed everyone felt this quiet heaviness and learned to ignore it. I believed that fulfillment would arrive later, after enough effort, after enough sacrifice, after I had proven myself worthy of it. What I didn't understand then was that a life can be orderly, respectable, and completely disconnected from the person living it. And when you spend years walking a path chosen by expectations instead of truth, you don't notice the distance growing. Until one day it feels too large to ignore. Learning to please before learning to live. Somewhere along the way, without a clear beginning, I learned that being liked felt safer than being honest. I noticed how approval softened conversations, how smiles reduced tension, and how agreement kept everything moving smoothly. Slowly, pleasing others became less of a choice and more of a habit. I became skilled at sensing what people wanted from me before they had to say it. I adjusted my tone, my opinions, even my silence to match the room. It felt easier to adapt than to explain myself, easier to agree than to risk discomfort. At first, this ability felt like kindness. I told myself I was considerate, understanding, flexible. And people responded well to that version of me. They trusted me. They leaned on me. They felt comfortable around me. That comfort became my proof that I was doing something right. But there was a quiet cost I didn't notice at the time. Each time I placed someone else's comfort above my own truth, I stepped a little further away from myself. Not dramatically, not painfully, just enough that it felt normal. I learned how to delay my feelings, how to store them away for later, telling myself I would deal with them when things were calmer. But later rarely arrived. Life stayed busy. People kept needing things. And I stayed useful. Over time, pleasing others stopped feeling generous and started feeling automatic. I wasn't choosing it anymore. I was defaulting to it. And when you live long enough in default mode, you forget that alternatives ever existed. I didn't realize then that learning how to please before learning how to live would shape nearly every decision I made afterward. It didn't look like a mistake. It looked like a well-behaved life. When patience becomes self-abandonment. For a long time, I believed patience was always a virtue. I was proud of how much I could endure without complaint. I stayed in situations that drained me, convinced that leaving too soon meant I hadn't tried hard enough. I told myself that strong people stayed, that mature people endured. I confused tolerance with wisdom. I thought enduring discomfort was proof of character. And because nothing broke all at once, I assumed nothing was wrong. The exhaustion came slowly, settling into my body so gently that I mistook it for normal life. There were moments when something inside me whispered that I should stop, speak up, or walk away. But I answered those whispers with logic. I reminded myself of responsibilities, of promises, of how inconvenient my honesty might be for others. Patience, when practiced without self-respect, quietly transforms into abandonment. Not the dramatic kind, no arguments, no sudden exits, but the silent kind where you slowly stop checking in with yourself because you already know you'll ignore the answer. I stayed because staying was familiar. Leaving required explanation, courage, and the risk of disappointing people who had grown comfortable with my silence. Endurance felt safer than honesty, even though honesty would have been kinder to myself. Over time, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. The question felt unnecessary, even selfish. My role was to adapt, to support, to remain steady. And so I did, until steadiness began to feel like numbness. It took years to understand this simple truth. Patience is only a virtue when it does not cost you your voice. When it does, it becomes a slow erosion of self, quiet, respectable, and deeply misunderstood. The fear beneath the good behavior. For many years, I believed my choices were guided by reason and responsibility. I told myself I was being thoughtful, careful, and mature. But slowly, I began to notice a pattern. Most of my decisions were shaped not by clarity, but by fear. It was fear of disappointing people who depended on me. Fear of being misunderstood if I spoke honestly. Fear of being seen as difficult, ungrateful, or selfish after years of being dependable and agreeable. I learned how to present myself in ways that felt safe. I softened my opinions. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes I chose silence instead. I believed this was diplomacy, but it was also self-protection. Fear doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't demand attention. It disguises itself as logic, as responsibility, as concern for others. It convinces you that waiting is wise and that staying quiet is the mature choice. I postponed my own needs because acknowledging them felt risky. Wanting more felt ungrateful. Wanting different felt disloyal. So I convinced myself that endurance was safer than change. Over time, fear became familiar. It shaped my habits, my routines, even my sense of identity. I wasn't aware of how much it guided me, only that choosing myself felt strangely forbidden. It took many years to understand this. Fear does not stop you from living all at once. It asks you to delay yourself again and again, until postponement feels permanent. Time does not wait for understanding. Time moved quietly, without asking whether I was ready. Days turned into years while I told myself I was still figuring things out. I believed there would be a moment when everything felt clear enough to change, when courage would arrive naturally and decisions would feel less heavy. But time does not announce itself. It doesn't warn you when an ordinary day becomes a memory. It simply continues forward, indifferent to hesitation. I began to notice small changes, how my body tired more easily, how silence felt heavier, how certain opportunities stopped appearing altogether. I told myself I still had time. Time to speak later. Time to choose differently someday. Time to become braver when circumstances improved. But later quietly stretched into years, and the future I kept postponing slowly became the present I was living. There was no dramatic loss, no single moment where everything fell apart. What disappeared instead were possibilities, the energy to start over, the confidence to begin again without explaining myself. These things didn't vanish suddenly, they faded. One day I realized life had been moving forward, while I was waiting for certainty. And certainty never arrived. Understanding came later, but time had already passed through my hands. That realization was not loud or painful. It was calm. And that calm made it heavier. Because I could no longer pretend that waiting was harmless. Time does not punish hesitation. It simply keeps going. And whether you move with it or remain still, it never turns back to check. The clarity that comes with age. As I grew older, I stopped replaying the past with anger. Time softened my judgments not by excusing my choices, but by helping me understand them. I began to see myself with more honesty and less blame. I understood that I made many decisions out of the knowledge I had at the time. I was not trying to fail myself. I was trying to survive, to belong, to be safe. And for a long time that felt necessary. But clarity arrived when I noticed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Again and again, I had chosen other people's comfort over my own truth. Not once or twice, but consistently, as if my needs were optional. It became clear that constantly putting myself last did not make me generous or wise. It made me invisible. I had been present everywhere, yet absent from my own life. With age came a quieter form of courage. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that allows honesty. I began to understand that peace does not come from being approved of. It comes from alignment. Alignment meant acknowledging what I felt instead of dismissing it. It meant listening to myself without immediately negotiating away my needs. These changes were small, but they were real. Clarity did not erase the past, but it softened its weight. It allowed me to see my life not as a series of mistakes, but as a long lesson in self-recognition. Choosing yourself is not cruel. For a long time I believed choosing myself would hurt others. I imagined disappointment, rejection, and distance. I thought that staying agreeable was the kinder option, even when it slowly erased me. What I didn't realize then was how often my silence made decisions easier for others, not kinder. People grew comfortable with my flexibility. They adjusted their expectations around my willingness to endure. Choosing myself felt unfamiliar at first. Saying no felt heavy. Leaving without over-explaining felt wrong. I had been trained to justify my needs, to soften my boundaries so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. But I learned something important. People who benefit from your silence often misunderstand your honesty. Not because honesty is cruel, but because it changes the balance they relied on. Choosing yourself doesn't always look gentle. Sometimes it looks like stepping away quietly. Sometimes it looks like disappointing people who never noticed how much you gave. Still, choosing yourself is not an act of harm. It is an act of honesty. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is lighter than a lifetime of quiet resentment. I began to understand that kindness without self-respect eventually turns into exhaustion. And boundaries, when placed gently, are not walls, they are clarity. Choosing myself did not make my life perfect, but it made it honest. And that honesty gave me something I had not felt in a long time: relief. What I wish someone had told me sooner. If there is one thing I wish someone had told me earlier in life, it is this. You do not need permission to be honest with yourself. No moment arrives perfectly prepared. Readiness is something we invent to delay difficult truths. I spent years waiting to feel certain before making changes. Certain enough to speak, to leave, to choose differently. But certainty never came first. It always arrived after the choice, never before it. If something inside you feels restless as you listen to this, it is not weakness. It is awareness. It is the quiet part of you that still knows what matters, even after years of being asked to stay quiet. Life does not wait for understanding. It moves forward whether you follow or hesitate. And while regret can be heavy, it is not the heaviest thing a person can carry. The heaviest burden is living a life that never fully belonged to you. A life shaped by fear, approval, and constant postponement. A life where your voice was always just one step behind. You do not need to change everything at once. You do not need grand gestures or dramatic endings. Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing honesty in small, quiet ways. Start where you are. Speak what is true. Listen to yourself without negotiation. Life lived honestly may be uncomfortable, but it is lighter than a life lived pretending. Because regret is heavy, but a life you never truly lived is heavier.